The air in the briefing hall was thick with the kind of tension that precedes either violence or legend. 1,000 soldiers packed the amphitheater at Naval Air Station Oceana, their dress uniforms pressed sharp enough to cut paper, their faces arranged in careful neutrality. On the raised platform at the front, Rear Admiral Marcus Grendel stood with his chest puffed forward, his jaw set in the particular way men set their jaws when they believe the entire universe has affirmed their righteousness. His seal trident gleamed under the fluorescent lights. Beside him, seemingly small by contrast though she stood 5'9", was Commander Alara Kincaid, call sign Valkyrie, her naval aviator wings pinned precisely over her heart, her face completely blank. What happened in the next 11 seconds would be dissected in ready rooms and officer clubs for the next decade. What happened in the next 11 seconds would force the Navy to ask questions it had spent generations avoiding. But in this moment, as Grendel's right fist came around in a wide arc toward Kincaid's face, all 1,000 soldiers saw was a flag officer committing an act so brazen, so inconceivable, that several would later insist they imagined it. They did not imagine what came next. Kincaid's left hand moved with the kind of precision that comes from 10,000 hours in a cockpit where milliseconds determine survival. She caught his wrist mid-swing, redirected the energy with a rotation so smooth it looked choreographed, and delivered a single right cross that connected with Grendel's jaw with an audible crack. The Admiral dropped like a puppet with cut strings, unconscious before his knees hit the stage. The sound of his body hitting the platform echoed through absolute silence. Kincaid stood over him for exactly 2 seconds, her breathing unchanged, then turned to face the auditorium. Her voice when she spoke carried the flat calm of someone reading instruments during engine failure. Medical to the main briefing hall, flag officer down. Then she walked off the stage, her spine straight as a blade, and disappeared through the side exit. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The question burning through 1,000 minds was not whether she would face consequences. The question was how they had reached this moment. The answer began 6 months earlier, in a desert that didn't officially exist, during a mission that never officially happened. The target compound sat in the Yemeni highlands like a broken tooth in a diseased mouth. Intelligence designated its structure 7-4 Alpha, which was military speak for, "We know something bad happens here, but we're not entirely sure what." The agency had requested close air support for an extraction gone sideways. 3 operators pinned down, ammunition critical, enemy reinforcements estimated at 40 combatants with technical vehicles. Standard nightmare scenario except for one detail. The compound sat in a valley so narrow and steep that attack runs required threading aircraft between cliff faces, with barely 50 feet of clearance on either side. The Air Force had already declined the mission. Too high risk, insufficient room for error, unacceptable probability of controlled flight into terrain. That's when the call went to VFA 87, the Golden Warriors, and specifically to their most experienced pilot. Commander Kincaid was in the officer's mess when her commanding officer found her, his face carrying the expression of a man being asked to send someone into a meat grinder. She was eating oatmeal and reading a technical manual on radar countermeasures, which was exactly the kind of thing Kincaid did during breakfast. "They need someone who can fly an F-18 like it's a goddamn sewing needle through a keyhole," her co said without preamble. She closed the manual. "When do I launch?" The pre-flight brief was conducted in a maintenance hangar because the mission was black enough to avoid official channels. A CIA officer whose name wasn't offered and whose face looked carved from granite laid out the situation with the kind of brutal efficiency that comes from watching too many people die. 3 agency personnel, 1 critically wounded, surrounded in a compound with 1 viable access point. Hostile forces with GPS coordinates and enough firepower to turn the valley into a kill box. Weather degrading with sunset in 4 hours. After sunset, thermal imaging would give the enemy every advantage. This was a daylight mission or it was a body recovery mission. The CIA officer's eyes settled on Kincaid with the weight of desperate men everywhere. "I'm told you're the best pilot in the Navy." Kincaid's response was delivered in the same tone she used for everything, flat and factual. You were told correctly. She spent 90 minutes memorizing satellite imagery of the valley, tracing the approach corridor with her finger, calculating angles and velocities and turn radii with the kind of mathematical precision her academy instructors had once called unsettlingly accurate. The valley ran north-south, 1,600 meters long, varying between 80 and 120 meters wide. The compound occupied the southern end, where the valley terminated in a sheer cliff face. Standard approach would be from the north, weapons release at optimal range, immediate egress. Standard approach would also telegraph her position to every hostile within visual range, giving them time to scatter or acquire anti-aircraft positioning. She decided on the non-standard approach, which was Kincaid's specialty. The F-18 Super Hornet designated Valkyrie 1 sat on the tarmac at an undisclosed location that absolutely was not a CIA black site in Djibouti. The aircraft was painted in low-visibility gray, its weapons pylons loaded with precision-guided munitions that cost more than most people's houses. Kincaid's pre-flight inspection was conducted with the same methodical attention she brought to everything, her hands checking surfaces and connections with practiced efficiency. Her weapons systems officer for this mission was Lieutenant Commander Marcus Reeves, call sign Optics, a 14-year veteran with more combat hours than most pilots accumulated in entire careers. He watched Kincaid work with the expression of someone trying to decide if his pilot was brilliantly confident or quietly insane. "You really think you can thread that needle?" Reeves asked as they completed the walk-around. Kincaid looked up at the F-18's tail, her eyes tracking the vertical stabilizers against the desert sky. The aircraft's wingspan is 44 feet. The valley at its narrowest is 262 feet. That leaves 109 feet of margin on either side. Reeves blinked. "You calculated that already." "I calculated that 6 hours ago. I've spent the time since calculating wind shear, thermal updrafts, and the optimal angle of attack for terrain-masked approach." She climbed the ladder to the cockpit. "Get in. We launch in 12 minutes. The takeoff was smooth because Kincaid's takeoffs were always smooth. The Super Hornet's twin engines spooled to full power, and 44,000 pounds of thrust launched them down the runway and into air so hot it shimmered. She climbed to 20,000 feet, the altimeter spinning upward while the desert fell away below, a landscape of brown and beige and the occasional dark smudge that marked villages or military installations or things better left unexamined. The flight to the operations area took 42 minutes. Reeves spent most of it reviewing the target package and trying not to think about the fact that they were about to fly an aircraft worth $70 million through a space barely wider than a suburban street. At Angels 20, Kincaid's voice came through the intercom, calm as someone ordering coffee. "Optics, I'm going to explain the approach profile once. Acknowledge when you understand." Reeves keyed his mic. "Go ahead, Valkyrie." "We approach from the south at 50 feet above ground level, terrain masked by the cliff face until we crest the ridge. That puts us directly above the compound with zero warning. We roll inverted at the crest, acquire targets during the inverted pass, roll upright for weapons release, then continue north through the valley at full military power. Enemy forces will be looking north for threats. We'll be on top of them before they can react." The silence on the intercom lasted 5 full seconds. When Reeves spoke again, his voice carried a note of something between admiration and terror. "You want to fly into a box canyon, pop up over a cliff, roll the aircraft upside down, pick targets while inverted, roll upright, drop ordnance, then fly through a corridor barely wider than our wingspan. That's your plan." "That's the plan." "Jesus Christ. He's not flying this aircraft, Optics. I am." Kincaid pushed the stick forward, and the Super Hornet's nose dropped toward the desert floor. The altimeter began unwinding, 20,000 to 15 to 10, the ground rising up to meet them with the kind of speed that made survival instinct scream warnings. She leveled at 50 feet, the F-18 now screaming across the desert at 450 knots, low enough that her jet wash kicked up rooster tails of sand. This was terrain-masked flying, using the Earth itself to hide from radar and visual detection, and it required the kind of concentration that left no room for doubt. The landscape blurred past in shades of tan and gray. Ahead, the ridge line rose like a wall, the cliff face climbing 800 feet into air turned gold by afternoon sun. Kincaid's hands moved across the controls with economy of motion, making tiny adjustments that kept the aircraft steady despite thermals rising from superheated rock. 30 seconds to target, Reeves called, his voice tight. Kincaid didn't respond. Her entire world had narrowed to airspeed, altitude, angle of attack. The cliff face filled the windscreen, growing larger with terrifying speed. At this altitude and velocity, there was no room for error. If she pulled up too early, radar would detect them. Too late, and they'd paint their souls across 800-year-old rock. She held course until her brain screamed to pull back, then held it 3 seconds longer. Then she pulled. The Super Hornet rotated backward, the nose coming up vertical, then past vertical, the G-forces crushing down with the weight of physics and momentum. The cliff face flashed past her canopy, close enough to see individual rock formations. Then they were above the ridge, weightless at the apex of the climb. The entire valley spread below them like a relief map. Kincaid rolled the aircraft inverted in one smooth motion. Hanging upside down in her harness, looking through the canopy at the ground above her head, she saw the compound exactly where intelligence said it would be. More importantly, she saw the 40-plus hostile forces scattered around it, their attention focused north, their weapons pointed the wrong direction. They never saw it coming. "Target lock," Reeves called, his voice calm now because when the shooting started, everyone got calm. 3 technicals, multiple dismounts, 1 structure with probable hostages. Kincaid rolled upright, her fingers already moving to weapons release. The precision-guided munitions separated from the aircraft with chunks that felt through the airframe. She counted 2 seconds, watching her targeting display, then pulled hard right and dove into the valley mouth. Behind them, the northern end of the compound ceased to exist in a sequence of explosions that turned afternoon into temporary dawn. The radio crackled with voices, urgent and overlapping. "Valkyrie 1, this is Groundhog 3-2, good effects, good effects." Secondary explosions on the technicals. Kincaid was already focused on the valley walls rising on either side, the space between them exactly as narrow as calculations promised. She trimmed the aircraft to centerline, her eyes moving in constant scan pattern. Airspeed, altitude, vertical clearance, lateral clearance, engine instruments. The valley walls were close enough to create acoustic effects, the roar of her engines bouncing back in delayed echo. At 400 knots, the 1,600-meter length of the valley took approximately 9 seconds to traverse. 9 seconds with no margin for error, no room for corrections, nothing but absolute precision or absolute death. The walls blurred past in streaks of brown and gray. Kincaid held centerline like it was painted on the sky. "Valkyrie 1, Groundhog 3-2, we are mobile, hostiles neutralized. You are cleared to egress. And holy shit, that was the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." She didn't respond until they cleared the north end of the valley, the walls falling away, open desert ahead. "Groundhog Valkyrie 1, good hunting. We're Winchester and heading home." She climbed to altitude in smooth ascent, the adrenaline that had been conspicuously absent during the attack run now arriving in delayed cascade. Her hands were steady. They were always steady. Reeves' voice came through the intercom, quiet and carrying the particular tone men use when they've witnessed something they'll tell their grandchildren about. "Valkyrie, I've flown with a lot of pilots. I've never seen anyone fly like that." Kincaid checked her fuel state and calculated the return vector. "It's just math optics." That wasn't math, that was art. She didn't respond because she didn't know how. The return flight was uneventful, which in combat aviation was the best possible outcome. They landed at the black site as the sun touched the horizon, turning the desert red and gold. By the time she shut down the engines and completed the post-flight checklist, a small crowd had gathered on the tarmac. The CIA officer was there, his granite face showing something that might have been relief or respect or both. The 3 operators they'd extracted were there too, one on a stretcher but alive, all of them watching Kincaid with expressions that needed no translation. She climbed down from the cockpit, her flight suit dark with sweat, her hair matted, her face showing nothing at all. The CIA officer approached with hand extended. "Commander Kincaid, on behalf of—" "Save it," she said, not impolitely. "Are your people intact?" "Thanks to you, yes," she nodded once. "Then we're done here." She walked past him toward the debriefing building, her boots crunching on tarmac that still radiated heat. Behind her, Reeves was describing the mission to anyone who would listen, his hands cutting arcs through the air, his voice carrying across the compound. She didn't stay to listen. She never stayed to listen. What Kincaid didn't know, couldn't know, was that one of the extracted operators was the younger brother of Rear Admiral Marcus Grendel, and that the Admiral had been in the CIA Operations Center watching satellite feed of the entire mission. What she didn't know was that Grendel had watched her thread his brother's life through that impossible valley, and instead of gratitude, had felt something else entirely. Something darker. Because Marcus Grendel had spent 30 years as a Navy SEAL, had spent 3 decades building an identity around being the most dangerous man in any room, and in 90 seconds of video feed, he'd watched a woman do something he knew he could never do. That kind of competence, in the wrong package, was dangerous to certain worldviews. The seeds of what would happen 6 months later were planted in that moment. But that night in a temporary quarters at the Black Site, Kincaid sat on the edge of her bunk and allowed herself 5 minutes of stillness. Her hands were steady. They were always steady. Outside, the desert night was cool and infinite, the stars scattered across black sky in patterns that had guided travelers for millennia. She thought about the valley, the walls, the mathematical perfection of the approach. She thought about the operators she'd pulled out, the lives continuing because of calculations done correctly. Then she thought about her father, who'd been a pilot before her, who died in a training accident when she was 12, whose last words to her had been, "Fly it like you mean it." She'd meant it today. She meant it every day. Sleep came eventually, dreamless and complete, the sleep of someone who'd done their job and done it well. Morning would bring paperwork and after-action reports and the usual bureaucratic machinery that followed successful black operations. But that was morning's problem. The story of what Alara Kincaid had done in the Yemeni highlands spread through the naval aviation community with the speed that extraordinary stories always spread. It was discussed in ready rooms and officer clubs, analyzed and dissected and mythologized. Some called it the most remarkable piece of flying they'd ever heard of. Some called it reckless. A few called it both. Rear Admiral Marcus Grendel heard all of it, sitting in his office at the Pentagon, his jaw tight. He put in the request for Kincaid to brief at Oceana 3 months later. He couched it as recognition, as honor. The request was approved because nobody declines when a flag officer asks for a combat veteran to share lessons learned. Kincaid received the orders and read them with the same absence of emotion she brought to everything else. A briefing. Fine. She'd done briefings before. She packed her dress uniform, ensured her ribbons were properly arranged, and flew commercial to Virginia Beach. The Navy didn't waste jet fuel on cross-country trips for commanders. She checked into visiting officer quarters, reviewed her presentation notes, and tried not to think about the fact that she hated public speaking almost as much as she loved flying. The morning of the briefing, she arrived 2 hours early because preparation was its own form of control. The amphitheater at Oceana was already filling with personnel, an entire base's worth of sailors and officers assembling for what had been advertised as a major tactical briefing. Kincaid stood backstage, reviewing her slides when Admiral Grendel found her. He was bigger than she'd expected, his SEAL trident prominent, his eyes carrying an intensity that immediately set her internal alert system humming. "Commander Kincaid," he said, extending his hand. "Admiral Grendel. I wanted to personally thank you for saving my brother's life." She shook his hand, nodding the grip that was slightly too firm, the eye contact that was slightly too long. "Just doing my job, sir. One hell of a job." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "I'm looking forward to your presentation. The footage from that mission has been viewed by every flag officer in the Navy. You've made quite an impression." Something in his tone carried an edge she couldn't quite identify. She nodded once professionally. "I hope the briefing meets expectations, sir." "Oh, I'm sure it will be memorable." He released her hand and walked away, leaving Kincaid with the distinct feeling that she'd missed something important in the conversation. She dismissed it, focused on her presentation notes. 15 minutes later, the auditorium was full. 1,000 soldiers in dress uniform, the rows packed tight, the air conditioning fighting a losing battle against body heat. Kincaid stood in the wings, waiting for her introduction, her stomach tight in the way it always got before public speaking but never before combat. The base commander took the stage, ran through preliminary announcements, then introduced Admiral Grendel, who would be providing opening remarks. Grendel climbed to the platform with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to command. He gripped the podium, surveyed the audience, then began to speak. What happened next would later be described by witnesses as uncomfortable, bizarre, and a goddamn train wreck. Grendel started his remarks with standard praise for naval aviation, for the critical role pilots played in modern warfare, for the dedication required to earn wings. Standard stuff, delivered with standard flag officer gravitas. Then his tone shifted. "But let's talk about something nobody wants to discuss," he said, his voice carrying across the silent auditorium. "Let's talk about standards, about whether we've allowed political correctness to compromise operational effectiveness, about whether diversity quotas are putting lives at risk." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Kincaid, standing in the wings, felt her stomach go from tight to cold stone. "I've spent 30 years as a Navy SEAL," Grendel continued, his voice rising. "I've operated in every shithole on this planet. I've seen what happens when standards get lowered, when we prioritize feelings over capability. And I'm here to tell you we have a problem." He gestured toward the wings, toward where Kincaid stood just out of sight. Commander Kincaid performed admirably in Yemen. Nobody's disputing that. But let's be honest about what we're celebrating. We're celebrating someone who was in the right place at the right time, who got lucky threading a needle that should never have been threaded. We're turning tactical recklessness into heroism because it fits a narrative the Pentagon wants to push. The silence in the auditorium had weight now, physical and oppressive. Sailors sat frozen, faces blank, nobody willing to move or breathe. Grendel kept talking. "Don't get me wrong, women have a place in the military, support roles, logistics, intelligence, but combat aviation, putting someone in a $70 million aircraft who's statistically more likely to make emotional decisions under stress, that's not progress, that's liability." Backstage, Kincaid's hands had balled into fists at her sides. She'd heard versions of this speech before, in whispers and insinuations, in jokes disguised as compliments, in the 1,000 small cuts that came with being female in a male-dominated field. But she'd never heard it from a flag officer, on a stage, in front of 1,000 witnesses. "I'm a Navy SEAL," Grendel said, his voice dropping to something almost intimate, almost confiding. "And I'm telling you I wouldn't want someone like Commander Kincaid as my close air support. I want someone I can trust, someone whose biology doesn't compromise their judgment." That's when Kincaid walked onto the stage. She didn't storm, didn't rush. She simply walked, her stride even, her face expressionless. She crossed the platform until she stood directly in front of Grendel, maybe 3 feet separating them. The Admiral turned toward her, his expression shifting from surprise to something harder. For 5 seconds, neither spoke. Then Kincaid's voice cut through the silence, not loud but carrying perfectly in the acoustic space. "Say it to my face." Grendel's jaw tightened. "Excuse me, Commander. You question my competence to an auditorium full of my peers. I'm giving you the opportunity to do it to my face. Say it again." The Admiral's face reddened. "This is inappropriate. You're out of line." "I'm out of line. You just gave a 20-minute speech about how my biology makes me a liability and I'm out of line." Her voice remained flat, factual, the same tone she used for everything. "Say it to my face, sir. Tell me how I'm too emotional, how I got lucky, how I shouldn't be trusted." Grendel took a step forward, his size suddenly very apparent. He had 6 inches and 80 pounds on Kincaid, and in that moment he seemed very aware of both facts. "You want to do this here, Commander, in front of everyone. You started it in front of everyone. I'm just giving you the chance to finish. That's when Grendel's control snapped. Later, he would claim stress, would claim PTSD, would claim a dozen things that might have explained but could never excuse what happened next. His right fist came around in a wide arc, a punch telegraphed so clearly that anyone with combat training would have seen it coming. Kincaid saw it coming. Her left hand moved with the precision of 10,000 hours in a cockpit, caught his wrist mid-swing, redirected the energy. Her right fist came up and connected with his jaw, a single perfect cross delivered with every ounce of frustration and rage she'd suppressed for 15 years of dealing with men like Marcus Grendel. The sound of impact echoed through the amphitheater. The Admiral dropped instantly, unconscious before his knees buckled, his body crumpling to the stage in a sequence that seemed to happen in slow motion. Kincaid stood over him for exactly 2 seconds, her breathing unchanged, her hands steady. Then she turned to face the auditorium, 1,000 sailors staring back at her in absolute shock. "Medical to the main briefing hall," she said into the silence. "Flag officer down." She walked off the stage, her spine straight, her stride even. Nobody moved to stop her. In the front row, a young lieutenant broke the silence with a single clap. Then another sailor joined, then another. By the time Kincaid reached the exit, half the auditorium was on their feet applauding. The other half sat frozen, trying to process what they'd witnessed. Kincaid heard none of it. She walked through the exit, down the corridor, out into Virginia sunshine that felt like judgment. Her hands were steady. They were always steady. The consequences arrived with bureaucratic speed. By the time Kincaid reached visiting officer quarters, 2 shore patrol personnel were waiting. They were professional, respectful, and absolutely clear that she was being detained pending investigation. She went without protest because protest was pointless. The brig at Oceana was clean and efficient, a cell that felt more like a dormant storage than punishment. They let her keep her phone with the warning that all communications would be monitored. The first call came from her commanding officer, his voice tight with stress. "Jesus Christ, Alara, what happened?" she told him factually without embellishment. The speech, the provocation, the Admiral's punch, her response. Her co was silent for 10 seconds. "You understand you just struck a flag officer. He struck first. That's not going to matter to Jag. Then Jag better review the security footage." The call ended with promises that he'd do everything possible, which they both knew meant very little against the machinery of military justice. The second call came from Reeves, her former WSO, his voice carrying disbelief. "Valkyrie, I just saw the video. Everyone's seen the video. You knocked out a goddamn admiral. He questioned my competence based on my gender, then assaulted me. I responded appropriately." Appropriately. Jesus. Half the Navy thinks you're a hero, and the other half thinks you're about to go to Leavenworth. She didn't respond because there was nothing to say. The truth was simple. She'd struck a flag officer. The circumstances would matter, but they might not matter enough. The third call came from an unexpected source. The CIA officer from Yemen, the one whose brother Kincaid had extracted. His voice carried an authority that transcended rank. "Commander Kincaid, I've reviewed the footage from Oceana. I've also made some calls. You need to know that Grendel's been under psychiatric evaluation for 6 months. PTSD from Syria, potentially compromised judgment. The Navy's been trying to figure out how to ease him into retirement without scandal. That doesn't help me. It will when I testify at your court-martial that he's been exhibiting erratic behavior since his brother's extraction. That his obsession with you has been documented in multiple communications. That he specifically requested this briefing as a platform to humiliate you, which several admirals can confirm." Kincaid sat on the edge of the bunk in her cell. "Why are you helping me?" "Because my brother is alive right now, because you threaded a needle nobody else would attempt. Because what you did in Yemen was the single most skilled piece of flying I've witnessed in 20 years of operations. Because Marcus Grendel is a bitter man who couldn't handle the fact that someone he considered inferior did something he never could. Pick your reason, Commander." The court-martial convened 3 weeks later at Naval Station Norfolk. The prosecution argued that Kincaid had struck a superior officer, which was factually accurate and legally unambiguous. The defense argued self-defense, which was also factually accurate but legally complicated. What neither side anticipated was the testimony. The auditorium security footage showed everything: Grendel's speech, his approach, his thrown punch, Kincaid's response. But more importantly, dozens of witnesses came forward. Sailors who'd heard Grendel's remarks and found them professionally inappropriate. Officers who confirmed the Admiral had specifically requested Kincaid for the briefing. Mental health professionals who detailed Grendel's deteriorating psychological state. And the CIA officer, whose testimony carried weight that transcended normal chain of command. He described the Yemen mission in detail, his words painting a picture of skill so extraordinary that even the prosecution seemed moved. What Commander Kincaid did that day required not just courage but mathematical precision under conditions that would break most pilots. She didn't get lucky. She calculated every variable, executed flawlessly, and saved 3 American lives. That's not narrative. That's documented fact. The panel deliberated for 6 hours. They returned with a verdict that satisfied nobody and everybody. Kincaid was guilty of striking a superior officer, sentenced to reduction in rank and formal reprimand, but the sentence was suspended pending review of extenuating circumstances. Grendel was medically retired with full benefits and a quiet directive to never speak publicly about the incident. Kincaid walked out of the courthouse into Norfolk rain, her dress uniform soaked within seconds. Reeves was waiting with an umbrella and a car. "So what now?" he asked as they drove through gray streets toward the base. She watched the water stream down the windshield. "Now I go back to flying." "You think they'll let you?" "I think they don't have a choice. I'm still the best pilot in the Navy." It wasn't arrogance. It was fact. The Navy quietly reassigned her to VFA 14, the Top Hatters, one of the oldest and most prestigious squadrons in naval aviation. The message was clear without being explicit. They were moving her away from the spotlight but keeping her in the cockpit. She reported to the new squadron 3 months after the court-martial. The commanding officer, a captain named Rodriguez who'd flown combat missions in both Iraq wars, met her with an expression that conveyed neither approval nor disapproval. "Commander Kincaid, welcome aboard. I've read your record. I've watched the Yemen footage. I've also read the court-martial transcripts." "Yes, sir. I only care about one thing. Can you fly?" "Better than anyone in this squadron, sir." Rodriguez smiled for the first time. "Prove it." She proved it. Over the next 4 months, Kincaid flew every training evolution with the same precision she brought to everything else. She qualified on carrier landings with scores that set squadron records. She ran tactical scenarios with such consistent excellence that her call sign became shorthand for perfection. The other pilots in VFA 14 watched her with a mixture of respect and wariness. Nobody knew quite how to relate to the woman who'd knocked out an admiral, who'd threaded the needle in Yemen, who flew like the aircraft was an extension of her nervous system. She made no effort to be friendly or accessible. She showed up, flew brilliantly, and went home. That would have been the end of the story. A woman who defended herself and paid the price and returned to excellence in relative obscurity. Except 6 months after joining VFA 14, the world decided it needed Alara Kincaid one more time. The situation in the Taiwan Strait had been escalating for months. Diplomatic tensions wound tight as piano wire. The Chinese military had been conducting exercises that looked increasingly like rehearsals for invasion. American carrier groups maintained presence in international waters, a reminder that certain actions would trigger certain responses. On a Tuesday morning in October, those tensions exploded into crisis. A Chinese destroyer conducted a close approach on the USS Ronald Reagan that violated every maritime protocol. Warning shots were fired. Aircraft scrambled. For 6 hours, the 2 most powerful militaries on Earth sat on the edge of miscalculation. That's when a Chinese fighter pilot, possibly acting on orders or possibly acting on impulse, achieved radar lock on an American F-18. In the complex language of military signaling, this was equivalent to cocking a gun and placing it against someone's head. The pilot he locked onto was Commander Alara Kincaid, who was flying routine patrol and suddenly found herself at the center of an incident that could start a war. Her response would be analyzed by military historians for decades. Instead of breaking lock by evading, which would have been standard and safe, and would have left the situation unresolved, Kincaid did something else. She maintained her course, activated her own targeting systems, and achieved lock on the Chinese fighter while simultaneously broadcasting on guard frequency, the international emergency channel every military aircraft monitors. Her voice was flat, factual, carrying across miles of ocean and sky. Unidentified aircraft. You have achieved targeting lock on a United States Navy F-18 operating in international airspace. I have achieved mutual lock on your aircraft. You have 10 seconds to break lock or this becomes a weapons engagement. I am authorized to engage hostile threats. This is not a warning. This is a countdown. 10, 9, 8. The Chinese pilot broke lock at 7. The crisis de-escalated within hours. The Chinese government issued a statement about training accidents and miscommunication. The American government said nothing publicly and everything privately. In ready rooms and tactical operations centers across the Pacific Fleet, people whispered about the woman who'd stared down a potential war and won. Kincaid landed back on the Reagan to a flight deck that erupted in cheers. He climbed down from her aircraft, removed her helmet and found her commanding officer waiting. Rodriguez's face was split in a grin that looked almost painful. "Commander, that was either the bravest or craziest thing I've ever witnessed." "It was the only logical response, sir. If I'd broken lock, he'd have retained tactical advantage and implied weakness. Mutual lock created equilibrium. The countdown forced decision. You just threatened to shoot down a Chinese fighter over international waters." "I offered him a choice. He chose correctly." Rodriguez shook his head in wonder. "Get debriefed, then get some sleep. I suspect tomorrow's going to be interesting." Interesting was an understatement. Within 48 hours, footage of the encounter had leaked from sources that officially didn't exist. The audio of Kincaid's countdown became the most played clip on military social media, her calm voice counting down to possible war becoming a symbol of something people couldn't quite articulate but desperately wanted to believe. One pilot, when asked to describe the significance, said, "She didn't flinch. That's all. She just didn't flinch." The Navy, sensing an opportunity to reshape narrative around the Oceana incident, quietly let it be known that Commander Kincaid was available for select media interviews. She declined all of them. What she couldn't decline was the summons to the Pentagon, delivered by secure communication, requesting her presence for a closed-door briefing with the Chief of Naval Operations. She flew commercial to Washington, checked into a hotel she couldn't afford on commander's pay, and showed up to the Pentagon wearing her dress uniform with its modest collection of ribbons. The CNO's office was everything offices at that level were. Large, imposing, decorated with photographs of ships and aircraft and stern-looking men in various eras of uniform. The Chief of Naval Operations was an admiral named Catherine Preston, one of 3 women to ever hold the position, whose reputation for brilliance was matched only by her reputation for suffering no bullshit whatsoever. She stood when Kincaid entered, which was unusual and significant. "Commander Kincaid, thank you for coming." "Ma'am." They sat across from each other, and Preston spent 5 seconds studying Kincaid with eyes that missed nothing. "I'm going to be direct." Marcus Grendel was a decorated officer whose career ended in humiliation. The Taiwan Strait incident has made you, for better or worse, the face of a debate this Navy has been avoiding for decades. Some want me to make you an example. Some want me to make you an admiral. I'm going to do neither. Kincaid waited, her face neutral. "I'm assigning you to the Naval Postgraduate School as an instructor. You're going to teach tactics and aerial combat to the next generation of aviators. You're going to do it with the same excellence you bring to everything else. And you're going to do it out of the spotlight, which is where both you and this Navy need you to be." It was a demotion masquerading as an honor, a way to use her skills while removing her from situations that generated headlines. Kincaid understood all of this in the 3 seconds it took Admiral Preston to finish speaking. Understood, ma'am. When do I report? 30 days. Use the time to get your affairs in order. Preston stood, signaling the meeting's end. Commander, off the record, what you did in Yemen was extraordinary. What you did at Oceana was complicated. What you did in the Taiwan Strait was necessary. You're one of the finest pilots this Navy has ever produced. I wish the world was such that your gender didn't matter, but it does, and we both have to live with that reality. Kincaid stood, came to attention, saluted. Permission to speak freely, ma'am. Granted. I don't need the world to change, I just need to fly. Preston's expression softened slightly. I know, Commander, I know. The assignment to the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey began on a Monday morning in November. The California coast shrouded in fog that turned the world gray and indistinct. Kincaid reported to the Tactical Aviation Department, met her new commanding officer, and received her teaching schedule with the same lack of emotion she brought to everything else. Her students were a mix of newly designated aviators and experienced pilots being cycled through advanced training. They arrived for her first class with varied expectations and universal skepticism. She was, after all, famous now, which in military culture was often synonymous with problematic. Kincaid stood at the front of the classroom and waited for silence. When she had it, she spoke. I'm Commander Kincaid. You'll call me Commander or Ma'am. This course is Advanced Tactical Aviation, and I'm going to teach you things that will keep you alive when the shooting starts. We begin with a simple question. What is the purpose of a fighter aircraft? A cocky lieutenant in the second row raised his hand. To shoot down enemy aircraft, ma'am. Wrong. A fighter aircraft exists to project power in three-dimensional space while denying that space to adversaries. Shooting down aircraft is one tool among many. If you think your job is to be a gunslinger, you'll die in your first engagement. She clicked through to her first slide, which showed satellite imagery of the Yemen Valley. Let's talk about terrain-masked approach and why physics matters more than courage. The course became legendary within the school. Kincaid taught with ruthless precision, breaking down every mission profile into component variables, forcing students to calculate rather than guess, demanding perfection because anything less killed people. She was not warm, not encouraging in any conventional sense, but she was effective. Graduation rates from her course correlated with survival rates in combat, and within 2 years, assignment to Kincaid's Advanced Tactics section was considered both punishment and privilege. She lived alone in a small house near the beach, spent her weekends reading technical manuals and running along the coast. The world kept turning. Grendel died 3 years after the Oceana incident, heart attack in his sleep, mourned by the SEAL community and quietly forgotten by everyone else. The Taiwan Strait incident was analyzed in war colleges and gradually faded from public memory. Kincaid kept teaching, kept flying when schedules permitted, kept being the best at what she did. Then, on a Thursday morning 7 years after the Oceana incident, she received an email from a lieutenant she'd taught 5 years prior. The subject line read, "Thank you." The email described a mission over Syria, a close air support request that had required threading through a valley between mountains, enemy forces on all sides. The lieutenant, now a combat pilot, had remembered Kincaid's lessons about terrain masking, about calculated risk, about flying the aircraft rather than letting fear fly it. He'd made the run successfully. The troops he'd supported survived. He wanted her to know that her teaching had saved lives. Kincaid read the email twice, sitting at her kitchen table as dawn light turned the fog gold. She allowed herself 5 minutes to feel the weight of it, the reality that her knowledge had extended beyond her own hands into the hands of others, that the math and precision she'd perfected was keeping people alive in deserts and mountains she'd never visit. Then she closed her laptop, laced her running shoes, and went out into the fog. The years passed with the kind of steady progression that defined careers played out away from spotlights. Kincaid taught thousands of pilots, earned a reputation as the most demanding instructor at the school, and quietly declined every request for promotion that came with desk duty. She wanted to fly, wanted to teach, wanted nothing to do with politics or appearances. At 52, after 30 years in the Navy, she submitted her retirement papers. The ceremony was small, attended by a few colleagues and former students. No speeches, no fanfare, just the formal recognition that Commander Alara Kincaid's service was complete. She walked out of the building wearing civilian clothes for the first time in decades, drove her aging truck to the house by the beach, and sat on the porch watching the Pacific Ocean roll in with the kind of endless patience oceans have. The next morning she woke early as always, went for her run as always, and returned to find a package on her doorstep. No return address, official Navy insignia on the label. Inside was a single item, a photograph from the Yemen mission, the satellite imagery showing her F-18 threading through the valley, the walls impossibly close, the execution impossibly perfect. On the back, in handwriting she didn't recognize. Some things shouldn't be forgotten. Some people shouldn't be forgotten. Thank you for showing us what precision looks like. She pinned the photograph to the wall in her living room, next to her father's pilot wings. The retirement years were quiet in the way military retirements often were. Too much silence after too much noise, the absence of purpose more exhausting than the presence of danger. Kincaid found work as a consultant for aerospace companies, sat in meetings where engineers asked her opinion on cockpit design and weapon systems. She answered factually, offering insights that came from 10,000 hours of converting theory into survival. But the work felt hollow compared to teaching, compared to flying, compared to the mathematical precision of aircraft at the edge of performance. On her 55th birthday, sitting on her porch watching fog roll in from the Pacific, she received a phone call from Admiral Preston, now retired herself. "Alara, how's civilian life treating you?" Kincaid considered lying, decided against it. "It's quiet, ma'am." "I thought it might be. That's why I'm calling." There's a documentary being made about women in naval aviation. They want to interview pilots who broke barriers, who changed the conversation. Your name came up. I declined the media request 7 years ago. My position hasn't changed. I told them you'd say that. But Alara, listen. There's a generation of women entering flight school right now who don't know your name, don't know what you did. They're facing the same bullshit you faced, but they're doing it without knowing that someone already proved it could be overcome. The silence on the line stretched. Finally, Kincaid spoke. "What do you want me to say, ma'am? That it was worth it, that the system is better. I taught for years and still watched female students get questioned in ways male students never were. I don't know that I changed anything except my own life." "You changed more than you know, but that's exactly what makes your story valuable. You're not selling inspiration or pretending it's easy. You're just telling the truth." "I'll think about it." She didn't think about it. She tried to ignore it. But the idea settled in her mind like sediment, impossible to dislodge. A week later, she called Admiral Preston back. "I'll do one interview, one. I tell my story factually, no embellishment, no melodrama. If they want a hero, they should find someone else." The documentary team arrived in Monterey on a clear October morning. They set up cameras in her living room, the Pacific visible through the windows, her father's wings on the wall. The interviewer was a woman in her 30s who'd clearly done extensive research. "Commander Kincaid, let's start at the beginning. Why did you become a pilot?" Kincaid looked at the camera, then at her father's wings, then back. "Because the sky was the only place that made sense. In an aircraft, there's no ambiguity. Physics works the same for everyone. Gravity doesn't care about your gender, your background, your opinions. The aircraft responds to inputs. You do the math correctly, you fly well. You don't, you die. It was the purest meritocracy I could find." "But you found that wasn't entirely true." "No. I found that while the aircraft didn't care who I was, the people assigning the aircraft did. The people evaluating my performance did. The men who assumed incompetence until proven otherwise did." "Tell me about Yemen." Kincaid told her factually, without drama. The valley, the calculations, the approach, the execution. The interviewer listened with an expression that shifted from professional interest to genuine awe. "You made that sound routine." "It was routine. That's the point. It was just math applied correctly under pressure. But it became exceptional because people couldn't imagine a woman doing it. That's the problem. Not that women can't fly, but that people can't imagine women flying." What about the incident at Oceana? Admiral Grendel. Kincaid's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes went distant. Marcus Grendel was a man who'd built his identity on being the most dangerous person in any room. When confronted with competence from someone he considered lesser, he couldn't reconcile it, so he tried to diminish it to explain it away. When that didn't work, when I wouldn't accept his version of reality, he resorted to violence. I responded appropriately. Do you regret hitting him? No, I regret that it was necessary. I regret that a flag officer felt entitled to assault a subordinate officer. I regret that the consequences for him were comfortable retirement while the consequences for me were effectively exile from combat aviation. But the act itself? No, he needed to be stopped. What do you want young women entering flight school to know? Kincaid looked directly at the camera, her voice flat and factual as always. I want them to know it won't be fair. They'll be held to higher standards, questioned more aggressively, given less margin for error. Their mistakes will be attributed to their gender while their successes will be attributed to luck. Some days they'll wonder if it's worth it. She paused, chose her next words carefully. I want them to know that the aircraft doesn't care about any of that. When you're at Angels 20 with hostile contacts on radar, when you're threading a valley with 50 feet of clearance, when you're counting down to engagement over international waters, none of the politics matter. It's just you, the machine, and the math. Master those three things and you're untouchable. Is that what you did, made yourself untouchable? No, I made myself undeniable. There's a difference. The interview ran 90 minutes. Kincaid answered every question with the same flat precision, offering no inspirational platitudes, no easy narratives, just facts, delivered in the same tone she used for weapons systems briefings. The documentary team thanked her, packed their equipment, and drove away into California afternoon. Kincaid sat on her porch and wondered if she'd said the right things, if her truth would help or just depress the next generation. She decided it didn't matter. Truth was truth, regardless of how people received it. The documentary premiered 8 months later on a streaming platform Kincaid didn't subscribe to. She didn't watch it, didn't read reviews, didn't engage with the social media discussion it generated. But other people did. The clip of her interview went viral in ways documentaries rarely did. Her flat delivery and absolute refusal to sugarcoat reality resonating with women who were tired of being told to lean in, to persist, to believe that merit alone would win. Here was someone who acknowledged the system was broken, but had succeeded anyway through sheer competence. Flight school applications from women increased 30% in the year following the documentary's release. Several cited Kincaid's interview specifically, her honesty about the challenges and her demonstration that excellence was possible despite them. The Navy, recognizing the value of this, reached out again with another request. Would she consider returning as a guest instructor, running specialized workshops for female aviators? This time, she said yes. The workshops began the following spring, intensive 2-week sessions where Kincaid taught 20 pilots at a time everything she'd learned about surviving in the sky and in the service. She was brutal and honest and completely uninterested in inspiration. She taught tactics and physics and the psychological warfare of being dismissed by people who should know better. The pilots who attended left exhausted and better. One evening, after a particularly grueling session on terrain-masked approach, a young lieutenant named Janny Torres approached Kincaid. Torres was 26, newly designated, and carried herself with the particular wariness of someone who'd already learned hard lessons. "Ma'am, can I ask you something personal?" Kincaid was packing her teaching materials, ready to escape to her hotel. "Make it quick. Did you ever get tired, not physically, but tired of fighting the same battles over and over? Tired of proving yourself to people who'd already decided you couldn't?" Kincaid stopped packing, looked at Torres directly. "Every day. How did you keep going? Because stopping would mean they were right, because someone had to show it was possible, because flying was the only thing I ever loved and I wasn't going to let small men take it from me." Torres nodded slowly. "Thank you for being honest. Lieutenant, if I'm not honest with you, then this is all performance. You deserve better." After Torres left, Kincaid sat alone in the empty classroom, looking at the tactical diagram still on the whiteboard. The valley from Yemen was there, drawn in her own hand, the margins marked in meters and the approach angle calculated to 3 decimal places. It was just math. It had always been just math. But math, applied with precision and courage, could save lives, could change minds, could become something greater than numbers on a page. Years continued. Kincaid taught her workshops, consulted with aerospace firms, ran along the beach, and lived quietly. At 60, she looked like someone who'd spent 3 decades in cockpits, lean, weathered, eyes that saw distances most people couldn't imagine. Her hair was gray now, cut short as it had always been. Her hands remained steady. At 62, she received a letter from the Naval Academy inviting her to speak at the graduation ceremony. She almost declined, then reconsidered. The graduation ceremony was conducted on a perfect May morning, the sky overhead so blue it hurt to look at directly. 4,000 midshipmen sat in perfect ranks, their dress uniforms crisp, their futures spreading before them like unwritten pages. Kincaid stood at the podium and looked out at faces that seemed impossibly young. She'd prepared no speech, carried no notes. When she spoke, her voice carried clearly across the assembled thousands. You're about to enter a military that will test you in ways you can't yet imagine. Some of those tests will involve enemy action. Most will involve your own service members, your own chain of command, the systems and structures that are supposed to support you but sometimes won't. She paused, let that settle. I became a pilot because the sky was honest. The aircraft responds to inputs regardless of who's providing them. Physics is the purest form of meritocracy, but the military isn't physics. It's people, and people bring their biases, their assumptions, their limitations. I won't tell you it's fair. It isn't. I won't tell you that merit alone will carry you. It won't. What I will tell you is that competence, applied with precision and sustained over time, becomes undeniable, not quickly, not easily, but eventually. She looked out at the sea of faces, tried to imagine their futures, their struggles, their triumphs. Some of you will face resistance from people who can't imagine you succeeding. Some will face violence from those who feel threatened by your competence. What you do in those moments will define not just your career but the path for those who follow. I can't tell you the right choice, but I can tell you this: the mission matters, the people you're protecting matter, your own integrity matters, everything else is noise. She stepped back from the podium. The applause started slowly, then built, washing over her in waves she barely registered. She'd said what she came to say. That was enough. The reception afterward was crowded with well-wishers and dignitaries, people who wanted to shake her hand or take photographs or tell her how inspiring she was. Kincaid endured it with her usual flat courtesy, counting the minutes until she could escape to her rental car and drive back to Monterey. A young female midshipman stopped her near the exit, her face earnest with the particular intensity of the newly commissioned. "Commander Kincaid, I just want to say thank you. Your career has shown me it's possible." Kincaid looked at this young woman, this person who would shortly be responsible for hundreds of millions of dollars of equipment and the lives of her crew. "Don't thank me yet. Thank me in 20 years if you're still flying. Thank me if you teach the next generation. Thank me if you make it through without compromising what you know is right." "I will, ma'am, I promise." Kincaid almost smiled. "Don't promise, just do it." She walked out into Maryland sunshine, got in her rental car and drove. Somewhere over the plains, flying west toward home, she thought about promises and trajectories and the weight of being example. She'd never wanted to be example, she just wanted to fly. But life rarely cared what you wanted. It gave you what it gave you, and you dealt with it or you didn't. She dealt with it. At 65, Alara Kincaid stopped consulting, stopped teaching workshops, and retired for the second and final time. She sold her house in Monterey and bought a smaller place in Oregon near the coast, where fog rolled in thick and the world felt distant. She thought she was done, thought her story had ended. Then, on a Tuesday morning in her 68th year, she received a package. Inside was a flight helmet, battered and marked with squadron insignia she recognized from VFA 14. A note was tucked inside, written in careful script. "Commander Kincaid, I flew this helmet during my combat deployment. I wore it because I wanted to carry a piece of your example with me. I'm retiring now, passing it on. Inside you'll find something else." She reached inside the helmet and found a flash drive. On it, in permanent marker, "Play Me." She inserted it into her laptop. The screen filled with faces, dozens of them, hundreds. Pilots in flight suits, standing on flight decks and in ready rooms and in front of aircraft. They spoke one by one, their words overlapping into chorus. "You taught me that precision matters. You showed me competence doesn't need approval. You proved it was possible. You didn't flinch. You counted down. You threaded the needle. You stood up. You kept flying." The video ran 20 minutes, testimonial after testimonial from pilots she'd taught, pilots who'd learned from pilots she'd taught, ripples spreading outward across decades. At the end, the screen showed satellite footage from Yemen, her F-18 threading the valley, and a final line of text. "Some people change the world by making noise. You changed it by refusing to accept limitations. Thank you for showing us the sky had room for everyone." Kincaid watched the screen go dark. She sat in her Oregon house, surrounded by silence and fog, and allowed herself to feel the weight of it. Not pride exactly. Something quieter, something like completion. She'd spent 40 years proving that competence transcended assumptions. That math worked regardless of who performed the calculations. That the sky was honest even when people weren't. And maybe, just maybe, she'd made it easier for the next generation to reach the same sky. She thought about Marcus Grendel, dead for years now, his legacy reduced to a cautionary tale. She thought about the valley in Yemen, the walls that had come so close. She thought about her father's wings, still mounted on her wall, the metal tarnished but the memory bright. The next morning, she woke early and drove to a small airfield she discovered during her explorations of the Oregon coast. The owner was a former Air Force pilot who asked no questions when Kincaid rented his Cessna for the day. She pre-flighted the aircraft with the same methodical attention she'd brought to F-18s, checking surfaces and connections, running through startup procedures that were burned into muscle memory. The engine caught smoothly. She taxied to the runway, ran through her checklist, and pushed the throttle forward. The Cessna lifted off into morning fog, climbing through gray into blue, and Kincaid felt the familiar satisfaction of an aircraft responding precisely to her inputs. She flew north along the coast, the Pacific spreading to her left, the land falling away to her right. No mission, no threat, no one evaluating her performance. Just flight for the sake of flight, physics applied with precision, the honest conversation between pilot and sky. At 3,000 feet, she leveled off and looked out at the world spread below. Everything looked different from up here. The problems that loomed so large on the ground diminished to toy proportions. The distinctions that seemed so important became invisible. Up here, there was only air and machine and the mathematics of controlled flight. She flew for 2 hours, tracing the coastline, executing turns with the precision that had defined her entire career. When she finally turned back toward the airfield, the fog had burned off, leaving the world sharp and clear. She landed smoothly because her landings were always smooth, taxied to parking, and shut down the engine. The silence after flight was always profound, the absence of engine noise like physical pressure. She sat in the cockpit for 5 minutes, her hands resting on the yoke, feeling the residual warmth of flight. Then she climbed out, completed her post-flight inspection, and thanked the owner. "Beautiful day for it," he said, watching her with the appreciation one pilot shows another. "Every day is beautiful for it," Kincaid replied. She drove back to her house, made coffee, and sat on her porch watching the ocean. Somewhere, right now, a woman was climbing into a fighter cockpit for the first time, feeling the weight of expectation and doubt. Somewhere, a female pilot was threading her own impossible valley, proving competence to people who'd already decided she couldn't. Somewhere, the next generation was fighting the same battles Kincaid had fought, would fight them differently, would win differently, but would fight. The story didn't end. It never ended. It just continued, passed from one generation to the next, each adding their own chapter. Alara Kincaid's chapter was written. The needle had been threaded. The countdown had reached 0. The mission was complete. She sipped her coffee and watched the fog roll in, steady and inevitable as physics, and allowed herself to feel what she'd never allowed during her career, satisfaction. Not happiness exactly, but the quiet knowledge that she'd done what she set out to do. She'd flown well. The rest was someone else's mission. Her hands were steady. They were always steady.